Okay, so this video is going to pick up with the nutrient cycling in section 4.3, and we're going to start with the nitrogen cycle. So this one is probably a lot harder. You probably haven't studied it before in elementary school. So one reason that this is more difficult than some of the other cycles is that even though our atmosphere is about 70% nitrogen, it's in a form called nitrogen gas, where you have two nitrogen atoms, I think, triple bonded to each other, which means it's really hard for organisms to use it directly. So lots and lots of nitrogen, but not in a form that organisms can just absorb from the atmosphere. So we have three important processes that will convert nitrogen between different forms, from the atmospheric nitrogen to one form that can be used by living organisms to other forms that can be used by living organisms, and then back to the atmospheric form. And most of these processes are carried out by bacteria in the soil. So bacteria are extremely, extremely important in the nitrogen cycle. There's also some plants called legumes, if we look at this part of the diagram over here. And you'll notice on the roots of these plants, they have these extra little nodules. And in these nodules, they will specifically house bacteria to carry out the most important of these processes that we were talking about. So these legumes are really good at capturing nitrogen because they have these homes for these special bacteria. So let's look at these three important processes. So the first is called nitrogen fixation. Nitrogen fixation is the one that will convert the nitrogen gas, the N2, into a form called ammonia, which is nitrogen with some hydrogens added to it. You'll see down here ammonium, which is just a charged form of it with an extra hydrogen. But this form can be used directly from the soil. So that's one of the soil forms that can be used for living organisms. There's another process called nitrification, which will convert ammonia or ammonium into two other forms that exist in the soil that can be used directly by living organisms. And by particularly, we mean the plants, which will just absorb it. We call it assimilation on this diagram. And then that can be eaten, those plants can be eaten by other organisms to obtain their nitrogen. And so the nitrites and nitrates we see down here, ammonia into nitrites, then nitrates, these are all called nitrification, and there's special bacteria that will do each part of that. So there's nitrifying bacteria that'll convert ammonia to nitrites, and then there's other nitrifying bacteria that'll convert nitrites to nitrates. And finally, the last process we're going to focus on is denitrification, which is just how you convert the nitrogen gas back into, you convert the nitrates back into the nitrogen gas for the atmosphere. So in particular, it takes the nitrates form and converts that into the nitrogen gas to return it to our atmosphere. And so there's different bacteria, denitrifying bacteria, that will make that conversion as well. So nitrogen fixation we see going on over here, both in the soil by itself and in the roots of legumes. Then we see nitrification going on over here to change ammonia into some other forms, nitrites, nitrates, that can be used by living organisms. We see that being used up here in this assimilation, consumption. Decomposers will return it back as ammonia. And then finally, we have denitrification to take the nitrates back to the atmosphere. Here's another version of a similar process. So we see the organic matter that might be from waste products from living organisms, from dead matter, etc. We have the form of like ammonium that can be directly taken up by plants. We have the conversion to nitrates through nitrification that can end up in soil and rocks. Also can be taken up by living organisms. And then we have denitrification, which returns it back to the atmosphere. This is just a different diagram in case this one helps you more. So here's the diagram from the textbook, which divides it into biological, human, and physical and chemical processes. One thing to point out on this one is there is some physical and chemical processes. For example, nitrogen fixation can actually be done by lightning as well. So it's not only done by bacteria, it's primarily done by bacteria, but it can also be done by lightning. So we got a lot going on here if we wanted to kind of narrow it down. We have the nitrogen fixation, we have all the conversions within the soil, and then we have the denitrification back to the atmosphere. We also have the biological processes between living organisms and the soil, so things like absorption, I guess we should go this way, from the plants, and then from there into the things that eat them, and then everything gets decomposed, returned back to the soil, etc. And finally, we have some human processes. So what humans can do is actually remove the nitrogen from the atmosphere. You see this little factory here and things like that, and produce fertilizers, which can be applied to the soil. So that adds it to the soil. It can also wash off into the oceans or into streams, rivers, things like that. And that dissolved nitrogen will contribute to the biological processes as well. And then finally, we have the arrows going back up to the atmosphere for denitrification. So we're going to come back to the nitrogen cycle in a second, but really quick, let's talk about the phosphorus cycle. So this one is probably much simpler, even if you've never heard of it before. If you look at this, you should notice that there's a part missing that you saw in the other cycles, and that is the atmosphere. There's no phosphorus in our atmosphere. So this cycles entirely through things like soil, living organisms, dissolved in water, rocks, etc. So if you remember the rock cycle, that's helpful for this one. If we look at the biological processes, we have the soil phosphates that can be directly taken up by living organisms, like the plants through their roots. Plants are eaten, consumption by animals, everything decomposes, you can return them back to the soil. So you have that going on in the soil. You also have similar biological processes with the dissolved phosphates in the water and taken up by some of the aquatic algae and bacteria, things like that, which will be eaten by something, that'll be eaten by something else, etc. And then decomposed, returned back to the ocean as well. So those are biological processes. As far as the geological processes, if we start back again with the dissolved phosphates or the soil phosphates, those will end up in the sediments. Sediments will end up in rocks. Rocks will break down through weathering, things like that. It gets back into the soil, so you have that cycling as well. Finally, we have human processes where humans can mine those rocks, break it down into fertilizers, add it to the fields, it gets back into the soil. It runs off into the oceans, it gets into the oceans and other water sources as well, which then it can be absorbed by living organisms. So you have that cycling there as well. So humans can kind of add to the cycling of the phosphates. So now why are these two cycles in particular important? Well, that's because all productivity within an ecosystem is limited by what nutrients are available. And by productivity, we mean how many living things can live and survive. So if any nutrient is limited, then the entire food web is going to be limited. You're going to have limited numbers that it can support. In the soil, we can increase that productivity by adding fertilizers. So the main limiting factors in soil are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So if you look at fertilizers, they will directly tell you how much nitrogen, how much phosphorus, and how much potassium they have. In aquatic ecosystems, it can vary. In seawater, the limiting factor is usually nitrogen. So nitrogen levels are usually very, very low. And in freshwater, it's usually phosphorus. So while humans are not going to directly add fertilizer into aquatic ecosystems, it does run off. It doesn't stay in the soil. Extra gets washed off and into the water sources, which means that you then have increased the productivity and how much can survive and live and grow within those aquatic ecosystems. That may not sound like a bad thing, but it can be. So this can lead to a process called eutrophication, where these excess nutrients, usually the nitrogen and or the phosphorus, in aquatic ecosystems that got there probably from fertilizer or waste products from animals and things like that washing into the waterways, lead to an overgrowth of algae and plants. They have lots and lots of nutrients they need, so they grow and grow and grow. Again, sounds like a good thing, but not really. You might end up with something like this picture. And we call these algal blooms. And the problem is that they grow and grow and grow, and then they die. And the bacteria that decompose them will use up all of the oxygen. It also is blocking photosynthesis from occurring in lower levels, so you also have reduced oxygen from that. And that means other living organisms are not going to survive very well. You can see from this picture you have the runoff from fertilizers, animal waste, and silage, which I believe is just another form of animal waste. But it contains the nitrates and other nutrients. You get the large populations of algae and bacteria, cyanobacteria, things like that. And then you get the low oxygen levels that are going to kill off all of the fish. This diagram I've included because this is a map of some of the dead zone. I don't remember what year this data was taken from, but we see this pretty much yearly now in the Gulf of Mexico because you have all the rivers that are leading into the Gulf of Mexico that are washed through major farmland areas and wash excess nutrients into the Gulf of Mexico. And if you, so we'll get these yearly algal blooms in the Gulf of Mexico, and you can actually see the difference in the dissolved oxygen levels at various places. So where it's yellow and orange and getting into red are the lowest oxygen levels. And I'm gonna have to stop this video here because I have a class coming in a second, but that is the end of this. So that is the end of chapter 4. Next chapter we'll move into populations.